welcome to today's webinar. If you require any technical assistance, please phone Redback Support on 1-800-733-416. If you'd like to listen to this webinar through your phone instead, please dial in the number and the passcode listed in the gray bar below. Today, the AAA presents Part-Time Crisis Leadership, presented by Wade Harrison, Director of Red Consultant. Today's webinar will cover the following topics. Who are the first part-time crisis leaders? What is the capability in the organization? What is expected of them? What they have to deal with? Then look at the 4 things that can be done to assist part-time crisis leaders and help building capability in their organization. The opportunity to ask questions will also be provided. To ask Wade a question, please use the Navy hand icon on the top right-hand side of your screen. Questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. Before we start, I would like to take the opportunity to thank Wade for the presentation today, to provide you with a few updates for the AAA. National Conference Early Bird registration closes next week on the 31st of July. AAA National Airport Industry Award nominations are now open and close on Friday, August 9th. All award categories and the nomination process can be found online, https://airportsconference.asn.au/industry-awards/. For further information, please contact Erin Livingston, AAA Events Manager, by emailing awards@airports.asn.au. Save the date for Airport Safety Week, taking place from Monday the 14th to the Friday the 18th of October. Further details will be released soon. Stay tuned for the details. Without any further ado, let's begin the webinar.
Okay, good morning everyone. As was said earlier, my name's Wade Harrison and I'm from Red Consultant. And today I'm going to be talking about part-time crisis leaders and building capability in your organisation. Just a little bit of my background. I've had about the last 15 years doing emergency management. I've been lucky enough to work with both state and local government before moving into private enterprise. And then I've been consulting for about the last 8 years. And I've had the opportunity to work with a range of organisations from Catholic schools through to energy sector, and run a numerous number of exercises and sit with quite a number of teams who've been involved in managing crisis, which is where I've really got this topic from that I'm talking on today. As I said, what I'm going to share with you today should be applicable across a broad range of these teams, and that often get tasked with managing a crisis for an organisation. And whether it be a slow build event like a major flood or a no-notice emergency like an industrial accident, or plane coming in at no notice and crashing in an airport, or a major business disruption that might happen and cause an unexpected loss of an access or a major facility. If you've got any questions throughout the presentation, can you please type them in, and I will, rather than skip from question back to the presentation, I'll try and get to all those questions at the end of the presentation. All right, we'll move on. Okay, now the part-time crisis leaders I'll be talking about today, what I'm talking about when I talk about part-time crisis leaders, I'm not usually from emergency services, but these are people who are part of a team that's quickly stood up by an organisation that's not really used to dealing with emergencies or crises. Now, a part-time crisis leader, it could be a Catholic school principal who leads a school incident management team, or an ops manager at a gas project who takes on the role of emergency response coordinator, or even a local council mayor who takes on the team leader role in a local disaster management group. And what these and many other part-time crisis leaders have in common is that they usually get this role due to their leadership position in the organisation and not their experience in managing a crisis. Now, in an ideal world, actually, I'll just check for a minute there, because I've just realised the slides are not keeping pace with what I've got on my screen here. So if you just give me a tick, I'll just check with our facilitator if I can keep the slides rolling. So if you give me half a tick, I'll just try and work out what the issue is here. That's up. Because presently I'm on the third slide and it looks like people in the audience are only still on their first slide. So let's get to the operator. Okay, while we're waiting for the slides to catch up to what I'm talking about, because as I said, I'm still on the third slide here. Part-time crisis leaders, ideally, and as a part-time crisis leader, even though you're only doing the role part-time, there's an expectation that you will be able to fulfill the role of a crisis leader or emergency management team leader, and do that in much the same way as a full person who has this as a full-time role. And so what we're going to look at today is, here we go, we've caught up. Okay, I'll just go back one to where we should be. So we should be sitting here. I'll just wait for this slide to catch up. And what I'll be talking about is then we'll go on to see, as I said, we'll talk about full-time crisis leaders, part-time, and then we'll see what we can do to try and make the part-time ones become more like a full-time leader in some of the things that they do, and also how we can help the organisation. Okay, now we're back up to where we should be. Okay, so a full-time crisis leader, and I guess if you think of a full-time crisis leader, I use the representation of a chef here, and what does a chef have and a full-time crisis leader have in common? That means I'll be much more likely to deliver on what is required of them. And the things that they have is with a full-time crisis leader, it's generally their day-to-day role. And this is what they do every day for work. They have a familiar team. In other words, they work with the same people, usually in those teams, supporting them, and all those people in that team know their roles as well. They generally have specific instructions, whether it be if they're setting up for a banquet or a particular, if they were doing a wedding function, if you think of the chef, they would know what the recipes were and what type of meals they'd be making. So they have information that's quite discreet and just for this event. And often they'll have a dedicated workspace. And what I mean by that is, as if you're working as part of a crisis team, sometimes you'll have to work in a location that you're not familiar with. But this one here, they've got a dedicated workspace. They're familiar with it, and it has in there what they have and what they require. And the other thing that they have is their experience, and they've done this many times before, and they know what to expect. Now, if we compare this with a part-time crisis leader, let's wait for the slide to catch up. It should be coming. Here we go. A part-time crisis leader. Now, as we said, ideally, in an ideal world, it'd be great if all those people who take on a crisis leader role were full-time, but a lot of, as I said previously, a lot of these people who are in these roles are a part-time crisis leader, and it's not their day-to-day role. So as I said, they're rarely called upon to do it. The team members they have are often unfamiliar. They could be new or not even know their role and may have never had training in what they're about to do. If they're lucky, they have a plan. So they might have an emergency action plan for an airport, say, but it's one plan that has a lot of information. So it's quite a broad lot of information. It's not very specific for individual roles. So it has quite a lot of information in it. Sometimes they won't have a dedicated EOC, so they're often coming from a temporary workspace, and so they may have to do this out of a suitcase or a cupboard. So once they have emergency, they rock up to, might be the conference room, open up the cupboard, pull out their paper, pull out their folders, and have to set the whole room up. and often they'll have limited experience. And ideally, if you're lucky enough, you may never have to deal with an emergency, but the problem with that is you have very little experience or no experience at all in managing an emergency, and you don't really know what to expect. And also, the role of a crisis leader here is an add-on to what you're doing. So if your day-to-day role is an ops manager or it's a Catholic school principal, starting to worry about emergency management is something that you apply very little time and focus to. And it often falls into what I call that 1% category. You can spend about a 1% of your time actually looking at it because it doesn't add to your productivity. You may never use it, and it's something that may never happen. So why are we going to spend a huge amount of time on it? And so the amount of time and focus that a part-time crisis leader has to putting these things in place and getting familiar and having the training and all the necessary paperwork is very small. And so, but what we have to remember here, as I said earlier, there's an expectation that even a part-time crisis leader will be able to deliver on managing that event much the same way as a full-time crisis leader was, even though you're only doing it as a part-time, and you know, you're the lucky person in the room who was there at the time who got called into the role. So when a crisis leader is asked to or responds to a crisis, there's an expectation that this crisis will be handled in an efficient and effective manner, and to ensure that all the necessary actions are undertaken, the necessary stakeholders are contacted, and you provide the necessary updates in a timely manner. Now, this would be great if having a pre-prepared and set up team, but as you know, these events are often unpredictable. And I've just recently run an exercise where we were testing the team, and you go in there and they've got the room all set up, all ready to go. Now, for a team that's never done it, it's not a bad thing to do, but it's unrealistic from the point of view that that's not how a crisis or an emergency happens. Often they'll just come out of the blue and you'll have no warning. And as I've said here, you don't know when it's going to happen. Often it'll be done at little notice, and it might be at a very, shall we say, not a good time of the day for it to happen. It might be at the end of the work day, might happen after hours. In relation to a school, if we were doing this and it happened just before the kids left school for the day, it would be one of the worst times because they had that movement of people, and that they've got some certain times. So you don't know when this is going to happen. And if you're lucky, it'll happen when you've got everyone on board, middle of the day when things are nice and quiet, but generally these events happen at the worst time of the day or even the year. It might be when people are on holidays, but you don't have the regular staff there. What the crisis might be, like I said, it could be a cyber event, armed offender, a microburst storm. You could end up with a death on site, or even something completely unheard of, something like Fukushima with the nuclear reactor due to an earthquake. Especially in relation to an airport, you could have the logical thing is something, issue with a plane or a plane coming down, but there's also a range of other events you might have to deal with as well that might require an emergency or crisis team to be stood up. And as I said, you don't know who you're going to have available to manage these crises depending on the time. When we set up to do an exercise, often people will set in place, okay, who's our lead? This is a person we're going to train, and they'll only train that core team. And the trouble comes when you go to manage the event and someone's on holidays, it's after hours, someone else is on leave, someone's left, and all of a sudden you've got all these people who are unfamiliar with running a crisis. And so you need to think about, the who as well here, and that ties very closely to this part-time crisis role. Now, so that's a little bit about, a full-time versus a part-time, and also what sort of crises or emergencies you might have to deal with. But how do you move from there to actually build capability in your organisation, keeping in mind the things, as I said, in relation to being a part-time role, and also, the I guess, the never knowing when a crisis is going to hit or an emergency that you have to deal with, or even what type it's going to be. And so to build that capability, we're going to try and do a couple of things. And the best things you can do here is try and get someone who's in a part-time crisis role to take on some of those attributes or act more in a full-time manner. And we can do that by providing them with a number of tools and things like that. And we're really trying to help this part-time person improve their ability to effectively manage a crisis, more like a full-time leader. We're not saying they'll become full-time, but we're trying to make it easier for them to manage those events. And the other thing we're going to do here as we go through these things is this will not only assist the crisis leader that we've been focused on so far, but also the team who support them. And remember, the person in the middle, who might be the crisis leader this time, next time that person might be away, so it might be the person to their left or right who's going to be leading that team as well. And so what we're going to talk about here will not only help the crisis leader at the moment and possibly the alternate, but also the team of people who might have to step up and become part of that team. Okay, so I'm just going to go through 4 things which I believe are the easiest ones to implement and actually will provide you almost the best bang for your buck in some ways in trying to assist you with building that capability in your organisation. And the 4 things I'm going to go through is cherry pick. I'll explain what this means in a minute. Role specific, demonstrate behaviour, and practice appropriately. And as I said, these are the 4 things that I think will provide you with the greatest benefit to your part-time crisis leaders and also the team that will assist them. And it'll also improve that capability within your organisation. Okay, now, by cherry pick, what I'm talking about there is hopefully you have, and especially being with airports, you'd have an EAP, so emergency action plan. But the information in that, it's often a big plan with a lot of information, and those plans, I like to think of these emergency plans as it's everything for everyone. So at the front, it's got the administration section. It says when the training is going to be. It says how you can do changes to documents, who's responsible, what standards it relates to. Now, that's all well and good and needed in a plan, but in an emergency or a crisis situation, it's not really that relevant or helpful to you. And so what I'm talking about is going through your existing crisis or emergency plans and pull out those key bits of information that are relevant to dealing with an event or an emergency. And I'm not talking about we're not talking about a particular event, but dealing with emergencies as a whole. What are the key bits of information you need out of that plan and put it into a more usable format or even into things like activation packs. And some of the tools, now some plans won't include these, and this is where you may need to add to your plans. I'm talking about things like status boards, checklists, duty cards, notification processes, even activation things, and if you have them, the contact lists as well. Even though they may not be in your plan, they may be an appendix or an add-on. They're the sort of things that you want in an emergency. You couldn't give a rat, sorry about what I'm talking, but you really don't care about how often the plan's been updated or who you have to see about document changes when you're dealing with an emergency. You just want the key bits of information that are going to help you. And as what you'll find with plans, and some plans, they range in size from 50, 70. I've seen emergency plans at 120 pages, and not all of it is relevant to an emergency. And it's not because they've segregated it for different types of emergencies. It's often because they have a lot of administration and information in there that is relevant to a plan, but not relevant to the response to an event. And that's what we're looking at here, is the response, the information you need to actually manage and respond to an event. Okay, so that's what I mean by cherry pick your plans. The next thing is you want to then look at that information and try and be role specific. Now, by role specific, what I'm talking about is you know you have a team and your team may be made up of a number of roles. You'll often have your team structure. You'll have a crisis team leader or an emergency team leader. You might have a coordinator. And if you're using the AIM structure, you might have logistics, ops, planning. I know other places do a similar thing, but you will have a team structure worked out. And for each of those, you should have a duty card. So it gives overview as to what that person should be doing. But in that as well, you want to then add to that. So if you have an activation pack or a pack for each role, you can say, as a team leader or the crisis team leader, you need to have the initial brief agenda. You might want update brief agendas. You might want the, if you've got an action list for the team, certain things you need to do. And then if you're the person who is the, say, the coordinator of the team who helps set up the room, you may need templates of your status boards as well. So you know, oh, I've got to put these on the room. And in those packs, what you're aiming for is the key bits of information relevant to those roles to get them started and working in their task. Because you have, as we've stated earlier, sometimes the people in these teams are part-time as well. If you're lucky, they've had training. Otherwise, they'll just be someone who's there in the office or in the space you're working in, and you call them in to become part of this team. And rather than give them nothing, the idea is you go out the activation pack and you say, I want you to take on this role, and you've chosen the person because you know they should be able to do it, but that'll give them their duty card explaining what their role is, some of their key tasks, and then you have the key bits of information, whether they be checklists, some of the various tools, flow charts and those things that will help them in their role. And so they're not sorting through a plan of 60 or 70 pages, they're just looking at their key 5 or 6 bits of information. Because with this here, and comes back to why you have a plan, and the emergency plans or crisis plans are really there because you want your emergencies or crises handled in a consistent manner, and you also want the response or the way it's managed to be complete in the way that you've contacted all the key stakeholders and you've ticked all those things. Because in a highly regulated area like airports, when you have an event, you have to notify X amount of people within X amount of time, depending on what the event is. And the same with a lot of other areas. If you're in a large organisation, you may have to notify certain stakeholders within a certain period of time, and you may need to think about certain things relevant to an event. And that's where having it documented in your plan initially is good, but it's better to then bring it down to be cherry-picked out and given to the person who's responsible so they know that I've got to do this, this, and this. And that way you're working on that completeness and consistency in the approach to managing an event. Okay, the next thing here, and this is a big one that is often overlooked, and I actually believe it's one thing that if you've got a good team leader and you want to build capability, this is key. And I'm talking about demonstrating behaviour, and it's about demonstrating desired behaviours. So with this, you often get, and if you get an organisation where you've got a crisis leader who's quite confident in their role and what they do, sometimes they will not use the documented processes and tools to do a response. They think they know it, and often they can run off, and they'll run it off cuff. They won't refer to the checklist. They won't refer to the plans and that. But sometimes this can result in them not doing all the necessary tasks or missing certain things in the process. And they tend to work along, and this gets, and I guess if you get an organisation where someone's been there for a long time, knows their stuff, and they've been involved in a few incidents, they start to have this competence through familiarity, where they think they know, or they're fairly certain they know the process because they've done it a few times, but the more they do it, sometimes they just start to make their mistakes or their gaps get bigger because they just focus on the things that they think are key, not that the organisation thinks that's key, by the documentation that's been put together. Now, this was actually documented coming out of the 2011 the government review into the 2011 floods that hit Brisbane. And one of the things that came out of that was in relation to the dam operators, and that because it's shown that the dam operators did not follow the organisation's procedures in relation to how they managed the inflow of water, which in turn exacerbated the amount of flooding that hit Brisbane. And what they came back with, one of the findings was the dam operators did not follow the organisation's documented procedures in relation to how that should be managed. And so this can start to be that confidence through familiarity coming into play where, oh, we know what to do, we don't have to refer back to the documentation. And they think, and in their mindset, they're doing the right thing. They don't have to go back to the documents because some people think if I've got to go back to the documents, it shows that I'm not that familiar or I'm not that good a leader. But the best leader in this sort of place, and especially in a part-time role, is someone who goes through, follows the processes and uses the documented things and the tools available to them and demonstrates that to the rest of the team for two purposes. And the first purpose is that crisis leader is not always going to be there, and hopefully the alternate is in the room with them at the same time. And if they see that person use the checklist, the processes and that's what they will fall to do when they have to step up into the role. They know, oh, okay, I've got to get my pack out, I've got to read through this, I use this to go through the process in the room, this is how I run the team. If they see the person who's been the leader previously ignore that information, they'll do the same thing. And so it's more likely, so as I said, it's important the day-to-day. And the other thing it does, it shows the team who are following them that this person's using the processes, because hopefully all the team now have an activation pack with their key bits of information, with their duty cards, with their checklists, and they're going through and using those. And if the crisis leader is not using theirs appropriately or demonstrating that desired behaviour, the team can sometimes get a bit lost because we're not all following the same process. And also, the thing here, as I said, with that completeness and consistency, if you're always demonstrating the desired behaviour and using those tools and processes, the people up the line from you, so if this was, say, a lower level team like an LDMG or a school incident management team, the next team up, who might be a critical incident management team or the DDMG, they know what the process is below, and they should be part of this, having the framework and the structures in place, is the team above have an understanding of what the processes are that are being followed below. And if all of a sudden you've got a crisis leader who's not following those processes and not following the guidelines and documented things, it means that the processes that are being followed aren't always going to work. And so up here we're assuming this is happening, and maybe it's not because the person at the lower level is running off cuff. As I said, it's important, even if you're a very familiar crisis leader, you should take the time to stand back, use your documented processes, and provide that example to the entire team that this is the way we go through it. And it shouldn't be a rush. It should be you get your things out, you go through. And as a crisis leader, even a part-time crisis leader, your role is not one of being too task focused. It's really one of having that helicopter role where you stand back and help guide the team in relation to their roles and make sure that things are happening, making sure the status boards are being filled out, making sure the checklists are done, setting timings for your meetings and your briefs, and making sure those processes are followed through. And you can't do that if you're a crisis leader who's there making phone calls and getting really narrow focused or get a tunnel vision approach. And by using these tools, it can help keep you on track. And also, it means you don't have to think so much about the processes because they're there in front of you as a well-documented process. So demonstrate behaviour. And the next one, or the last one of these four, is practice appropriately. Now, set timing on this. By practice appropriately, this is one of those things, as I said earlier, as a crisis team, especially a part-time crisis team, you may never get to deal with an emergency or crisis where you actually put your plan into use. And as part of that, you can't, and it's all well and good talking about a plan in a theory perspective, because yesterday I was actually doing some training for actually part-time crisis team who were Catholic school principals. And we spend the first half of the session talking about the theory, talking about what's in their crisis management plan, what it contains, all that information. And the second half, after morning tea, we actually do a walkthrough rehearsal to try and put the plans and the processes into context. Because I said, talking about it in theory is great, but you need to put it into some sort of context. And by having an exercise, no matter what it might be or the way you practice, whether it be a facilitated walkthrough, a desktop, a full mock, or a full mock with external agencies involved, it gives you a chance to practice. But when I talk about practice appropriately, I'm talking about practicing which is appropriate for the maturity of the team in place. Because if you've got a very inexperienced crisis team and you throw in an exercise at them and they fail miserably, that does nothing but deflate them, and they say, why do we bother? Throw our hands up, walk away, and become very disinterested. When you start off with a crisis team or a very immature team, you want to start with, as I said, a facilitated walkthrough. Walk them through the steps. Give them a little bit of a challenge, and if they start to falter, help them. Show them what they can do. Walk them through the processes, and as they get more familiar and they have better understanding of the processes, then you can start to bump up, I guess, the level of the exercise or the complexity. With Santos, where I've done quite a lot of work, I got to the stage because I've been doing exercises with this run group for about 5 years. They've got very good at their standard emergency. And the last emergency I did, it was quite detailed, had a lot of external players in. We had people going from sites. We evacuated drilling rigs. We did a whole range of things. They handled it really quite easily. And it got to the point where the standard exercise is not providing them a lot of value. All it does is say, yep, we're pretty good at this, but it doesn't push them. And so with that group, I'm looking at running a high pressure test, as I call it, very much like you'd test a gas cylinder, where you, before a gas cylinder goes into use, they run it under quite high pressure to make sure the seams won't burst and all that thing. And then when it's just running at normal pressure, you know it's not going to fail. That's the sort of thing I'm talking about here. You might put together an exercise which is quite unrealistic almost, but it pressures them. Do something like an earthquake with multiple impacts. Now, quite unlikely to happen, but it has enough things in there to test them and really push that team. And so if they falter and they have a small crack show under high pressure, that's something you can work on, because at the low pressure stage with a fairly simple exercise, they're never going to be stretched or pushed. And so if you put them into a high pressure, those little cracks and chinks start to show up. As I said, you need to practice and make sure the practice is appropriate for the experience and the knowledge of the team that's there. Okay, so I said that's the whole half hour gone, and I said they're the main things there. So cherry pick the plans. So as I said, get your EAPs or your emergency plans or your crisis plans, go through them and pick out what are the key bits of information. And you won't get this right initially. I very much doubt there's any, like, I've reviewed quite a lot of emergency plans and written quite a few and run them through exercises. And if you've got an emergency plan or a crisis plan that's 80% right, you're doing pretty well, because it's not something you use every day. It's not like a work card that you go out, you set a work process today, and tomorrow you do it, you try it again the next day and the next day, and you can keep making it better and better. This is a thing that you put in place and may never get to test. And so you're putting theory down on paper about an event that may never happen and hoping the processes you've got are right. So as I said, cherry pick your plans, and you might find when you cherry pick them that you realize, oh, we've got a couple of gaps. We need to add a checklist, or we might need some agendas. What else does this person need? And when you get down to role specific, you'll get that some people will have the same documentation, because you might have the team leader having the action list or the action checklist for the team, but you might have someone who sits down a step also having that action checklist, so they can help support the person who's leading the team. And as you go through, you'll set up, as I said, with your activation packs, as call them, some people call them different things, just key to that person's role and any bits of information that are useful. And the other good thing with having activation packs is it makes it much easier to make what I call, I can't remember the name at the moment, but the pack, if you have to leave your site and work in an alternate location, if you've got all your activation packs set for your various roles, and you've got 1 or 2 copies of the plan, you can pick it all up, walk off site, and you've got a copy of everything you need, at least in a small version, so you can reproduce it in an alternate crisis center or EOC, no matter where you have to work from. And that demonstrate behavior, as I said, it's important you go through the process and demonstrate to everyone in the team how it should be done, because you're always training up the next person. So you might be the crisis leader today. Any one of those people in the room with you are possibly going to be the next crisis leader. And so you need to demonstrate the appropriate behavior or the desired behaviors and how the team should be run. And the last thing, as I said, practice, 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 but do it appropriately. And you can do that in a range of ways. Some places, at some of the schools I go to, they're actually looking at running a small, like a scenario card process, where they spend 10, 15 minutes at a staff meeting once every 2 months, and they pull out a card and go, okay, this is a scenario that's hit, how are we going to deal with it? And they just do a quick desktop amongst the people in the room and a lot rolls. You know, it's a good way to get people to think about things, and also refreshes people's minds in relation to, oh, where's that documentation kept? When was the last time we updated our contact lists? Where is that sort of information kept? And so that also is really helpful. Okay, so we'll now move on to questions, and I'm just going to open up, you won't see the questions here, and there are a number of questions. What I'll do, I'll read through them so you're aware what questions have been asked, and then I'll also try and answer them, hopefully. Okay, let's see what we've got here. Okay, so I've got a question here, or a comment. It says, Ian Bell's written, I've run numerous crisis exercises and also found it critical to exercise the likely delegates for each of the principal crisis team members, so it may be worth including that, or including this. And I think what Ian's trying to say there is, so this is where the likely delegates or the alternates for the principal team members, yeah, very much so. Sometimes you can run an exercise and you might have 6 people on the team, but you might have another 12 people sitting there as observers or backing up, knowing that I might have to step into that role. And that's where, when you're running those exercises, number one, you know, exercise or practice appropriately, but also demonstrating the desired behaviours, because unless the people in that room who are the alternates are seeing the correct behaviours being demonstrated, you know, how much benefits are going to be to them. So look at those desired behaviours there. Just scroll down here. Hopefully that's answered that one. And the other question is here. The other thing I've run exercises is in remote access, because many people travel. And I think from what Ian's saying here is, remote access is when you've got a crisis team, and depending on how your teams are set up, and I know they have the same sort of problem with parts of Santos, especially the higher level teams. Their state team used to be based just in Sydney, and now the next level up is split across Brisbane and Sydney. And so you'll have remote access, and so if you're going to run exercises, especially that test team that have remote access, test those systems as well. Like if you're going to use video conferencing and that is part of the process you've documented, you need to actually test it, because quite often you'll get to the point, oh, we need to set up and use this, and for some reason the IT is down for it, or someone doesn't have the log on, or the person who knows to set up the system is not here today. And so I said, if you're going to run exercises and your crisis management structure has a use for remote access or video conferencing or any of those processes, even in a desktop, I would try and use those sorts of things, because a desktop exercise is usually utilizing video conferencing is really quite a simple thing to exercise. And it's not a tough one to do, so it's not causing anyone to go outside, you're not upsetting a workforce, you're not bringing external players. But those sort of things where you have remote access, it's important that you have those things tested, and also the processes around that are quite heavily documented. So does anyone else have any other questions they might like to send in? No? Okay, if no one else has any other questions, that's all I've got for today. Hopefully this has been of some help to you. And if you've got any questions or would like to discuss this, anything in relation to this any further, please don't hesitate to contact me. You can contact me through, I believe, through AAA, and I can help with any questions you've got. More than happy just to have a chat about this or share any learnings I've got in relation to part-time crisis leaders, or how you can assist the teams in that. All right. Otherwise, that's all for me. So if you just want to follow what's on the screen at the moment, I'll see you next time. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Wade, for providing us an informative presentation. Thank you also to everyone for participating in today's session. We ask that you now take a moment to complete a short survey that you will be redirected to shortly. Today's webinar recording will be available in Airport Alert and emailed to everyone directly once available. We encourage you to provide feedback on any other topics that you would like to see covered by emailing events@airports.asn.au. The next AAA webinar is on wildlife hazard management, presented by Kylie Patrick from Avishur. The link to register will be distributed by Redback shortly, and details will also be released in Airport Alert. If you would like additional information, please email the AAA events team on events@airports.asn.au. Have a wonderful afternoon.